Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. At this time, I'm going to make my opening statement. When our forces invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the goal was simple: remove the Taliban government that sheltered the plotters of the 9/11 attacks and destroy Al-Qaeda. It has been 16 years that the United States has been at war, and Afghanistan is still a haven for terrorists who seek to attack and kill Americans. Just today, 2 Americans were killed in the eastern province of Afghanistan. Our military quickly toppled the Taliban government in 2001, and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces fled to Pakistan, where they regrouped and launched more attacks against our troops. Since then, the Taliban has waged insurgency in Afghanistan, destabilizing the country and creating perfect conditions for terrorists to exploit. The Taliban insurgency today is stronger than any other point since 2001. The Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction said in January 171 Afghan districts are controlled, influenced, or contested by the Taliban. As long as the Taliban is successful, this means good news for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has a long history of loyalty to the Taliban, or Osama bin Laden swore allegiance to the Taliban's leader, Mullah Omar, even before 9/11. And when bin Laden was killed, Ayman al-Zawahiri renewed his oath that cemented ties between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Wherever the Taliban has influence, Al-Qaeda is not behind. Since 2010, the United States officials have claimed that Al-Qaeda had small presence in the country, limited to only 50 to 100 fighters. That is absolutely incorrect. The United States has killed and captured more more terrorists since that time than was claimed to be in the entire country. Alongside Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, we have another terrorist group, the Haqqani Network. This group is directly linked to both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and is based, guess where? Pakistan. The Haqqani Network is responsible for more American deaths in the region than any other terrorist group. The Haqqani Network attacks inside Afghanistan have been directly traced back to Pakistan. In fact, in 2011, Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the Senate, quote, "The Haqqani Network acts as a veritable arm of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency." It seems that Pakistan has ties to about every terrorist group that is in Afghanistan. Pakistan openly supported the Afghan Taliban both before and after the extremists took control of Kabul in 1996. We know that the Taliban is still based in Pakistan, and it came no surprise that when a U.S. drone strike killed the leader of the Taliban in May of 2016, he was in southwestern Pakistan. The laundry list of evidence of Pakistan's support for terrorists goes on and on. We remember that when the Al-Qaeda leader and America's most wanted terrorist, Osama bin Laden, was killed, he was found in Pakistan. Afghan's representative to the UN recently told the Security Council that Pakistan maintains ties with more than 20 terrorist groups. And I ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record the full statement made by Afghan's representative to the UN into the record. And it is admitted. I believe Pakistan is playing us. They launched what they called counterterrorism operations in the tribal areas bordering Afghanistan, but quickly became clear they were only targeting the Pakistani Taliban and not the Afghan Taliban. ISIS announced the establishment of Afghan affiliate in January of 2015 and has entrenched itself in the eastern part of the country. ISIS' presence in Afghanistan further complicates the country's terrorist landscape. These fighters ended up becoming the leaders of the ISIS affiliate in Afghanistan known as ISIS Khorasan province. It is no surprise that Afghanistan is a mess. In the war on terror, it's crystal clear to me that Pakistan is not on our side. It is time that we consider listing Pakistan, 1, as a state sponsor of terrorism, 2, stop sending them U.S. aid, 3, remove and revoke their status as a major non-NATO U.S. ally. Our Pakistan policy should match Pakistan's behavior. And I'll yield to the ranking member for his comments.
Thank you, Chairman Poe. 2 U.S. service members were killed in Afghanistan overnight. Reports indicate that they were killed in operations against the Islamic State fighters in Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan. Words are truly inadequate to express our country's gratitude at the extraordinary sacrifice of these individuals and heroes, and our prayers with their family. As the continued threat of insurgent groups and instability within the country poses a direct challenge to the United States, this year marks 16 years of military presence in Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks. Our own security is linked to Afghanistan's security, putting the elimination of terrorism there and putting them squarely within our interests as well as a country. If we're to be successful in eradicating this threat, we must be sure that the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan is addressing the drivers of terrorism head-on. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, there are multiple drivers, and our prolonged military presence in the country underscores this complex reality. Internally, the Afghanistan's national unity government is still struggling to effectively address the many systemic problems facing their country: organized crime, illicit economies, rampant corruptions at all levels of the Afghan society require a coordinated and a robust approach from the government if Afghanistan is to achieve security from the national level all the way down to the community level. Taliban control in Afghan communities impedes the government's ability to limit recruitment and the threat of terrorism throughout the country. Strengthening the role of a democratic Afghan government at all levels is absolutely necessary in order to eradicate terrorism in the long term. Additionally, the Afghan military continues to encounter issues of internal accountability and operational effectiveness in combating terrorist groups. I've witnessed the U.S. military, along with our allied forces, training and advising Afghan forces for years and the significant progress they have made. However, there seem to be ongoing institutional challenges within the Afghan military that require further attention if their military is going to be sufficiently prepared to take on the long-term responsibility of managing the terrorist threat in Afghanistan. There's a role for the United States to play in ensuring that Afghanistan can achieve their own security and independently and internationally deal with the support necessary to do so. However, we also need to be clear on what form our role should take. The security situation in Afghanistan, and by extension the United States, is multidimensional and not solely comprised of military objectives. The governance issues in Afghanistan that are stymied and that have stymied the progress in the fight against terrorism cannot be resolved solely through the use of force and integration of military expertise. The whole of the government approach is what's necessary. That whole of a government approach that Afghanistan must undertake to combat this threat of terrorism should be complemented by the diverse expertise that the United States can offer in order to make sure the Afghan government is most efficiently and effectively moving towards greater security within its own borders. This means ensuring that our State Department and other key government agencies have the capacity to engage meaningfully with their counterparts and partners in Afghanistan. A whole-of-government approach here in the U.S. keeps our troops and allies safer. It also promotes longer stability in the country, a stability that will bring about a more rapid resolution to this conflict. I therefore join many of my Democratic and Republican colleagues on and off the Foreign Affairs Committee who are deeply concerned about the proposed budget cuts to the State Department and the impact they would have on our objectives in the long term. This is not only because of the complex situation within Afghanistan, but because of the role that other countries play in exacerbating the terrorist threat inside the country. We know that Iran and Russia have both provided assistance to the Taliban in an effort to encounter the threat and in an effort to counter the threat of the Islamic State groups in Afghanistan. Pakistan has had a long and complicated history, and they have a long and complicated efforts to combat terrorism in Afghanistan through its acquiescence in providing safe haven to terrorists, particularly the Haqqanis. So we need a balanced approach to tackling the terrorist threat in Afghanistan that reflects the complex and dynamic reality on the ground and in the region. Why should we tie one hand behind our back when we have the experts ready and waiting to make this difficult process of eliminating the terrorist threat a progress that should move forward more effectively and quickly if we take this approach? Today, I'm eager to hear from our witness about the lessons learned, about what's working, what's not working, and why. This is important as the White House reassesses the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan and as Congress looks forward to an appropriations process which gives us the opportunity to make sure that the most effective strategies to bring peace and stability for Afghanistan and the United States are appropriately funded. Thank you, Chairman Poe. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. So without objection, all the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that each of the witnesses please keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. When the red light comes on, you need to stop, or I will encourage you to stop. I'll introduce each witness and then give them time for opening statements. Mr. Bill Raggio, is it Raggio? Is a Foundation for Defense of Democracy Center Fellow and editor of the Long War Journal. Mr. Raggio was embedded with the U.S. Marines, the United States Army, and Iraqi forces in Iraq between 2005 and 2008, and with the Canadian Army in Afghanistan in 2006. Dr. Seth Jones is director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation. He previously served as the representative for the Commander, U.S. Special Operations Command, to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. And Dr. Vanda Velbab Brown is a senior fellow in the Center for the 21st Century Security and Intelligence at the Brookings Institute. She is an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats. Mr. Raggio, we will start with you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Keating and the rest of the distinguished members of this panel, or of this, committee. This is a timely discussion. Well, last week, the Taliban launched a major attack on an Afghan army base. 10 fighters launched what I call a suicide assault, where the fighters enter the penetrate security at the base, and they're not coming back. They're going to fight to the death. They killed at least 140 Afghan soldiers. This was an attack on an Army Corps base in northern Afghanistan, not in the south where everyone assumes the Taliban to be strong. I've seen reports of upwards of 250 Afghan troops killed in this attack. This is the Taliban is using tactics that's been honed and perfected by Al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State, which is the child of Al-Qaeda. We are losing in Afghanistan. The U.S. military will tell you at best we're at a stalemate, but a stalemate in that situation, the tie goes to the insurgent. And the Taliban controls or contests at least half of Afghanistan. The Taliban issued a report in late March saying they control or contest 211 of Afghanistan's more than 400 districts. That is very close to the SIGAR report that you had mentioned, where it was 177. That assessment was given by SIGAR in the fall of 2016. And in addition to the reason the Taliban matters is the Taliban and Al-Qaeda they remain tied at the hip. The Taliban refused to surrender Al-Qaeda members and Osama bin Laden after the 9/11 attacks. They continue to fight side by side. Al-Qaeda serves as a force multiplier. Multiple designations from the U.S. Treasury Department talks about how Al-Qaeda and the Taliban fundraise for each other in the Gulf states. This includes the Haqqani network, by the way. And we continue to see Al-Qaeda fighters killed on the battlefield. As a matter of fact, the U.S. military killed a senior Al-Qaeda leader just last month inside Afghanistan. So a lot has been made in the U.S. intelligence circles about the strength of Al-Qaeda. Under the Obama administration, we were told there were 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda fighters inside the country, and they were consistently given this estimate for more than 6 years. This all came to crashing down in October 2015 when U.S. military raided 2 Al-Qaeda camps, one of them described by U.S. commander as possibly the largest Al-Qaeda facilities taken down since 9/11. This is in Afghanistan, not in Syria, not in Iraq, not in Somalia or Yemen. More than 150 Al-Qaeda fighters were killed in this one raid alone. So we basically took out 150% of Al-Qaeda's estimated strength by the U.S. military that was given to in intelligence circles for more than 6 years. We have an intelligence problem in Afghanistan. We have a problem recognizing what the threat is, and until we determine where Al-Qaeda is inside Afghanistan and how they're working closely with the Taliban, we will continue to have a problem, and we will fail to properly deal with this threat. A lot of the threat in Afghanistan is looked at as being the Islamic State's Khorasan province. We dropped the mother of all bombs there, and as you both had mentioned, we've lost 2 soldiers in Nangarhar province last night. The Islamic State is on the fringe. It's a small problem in Afghanistan compared to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other Pakistani jihadist groups that operate there. They operate primarily in 4 districts in Nangarhar province and have a minimal presence in the north. And it certainly is a problem. Our efforts seem to be focused on the Islamic State at this point in time, while largely ignoring what the Taliban is doing throughout the country, and that is directly challenging the Afghan military. They're going toe-to-toe, they're raiding their bases, they're taking control of territory, and the U.S. military has been, frankly, has downplayed this problem with the Taliban. When the Taliban overran Sangin district, where hundreds of U.S. Marines and British troops died trying to liberate it during the surge between 2010 and 2012, when the Taliban overran that district, the military put out what I will say is a ridiculous press release stating, no, the district wasn't overrun. We merely moved the district center, and the Taliban took control of rubble. And if that's the attitude of the U.S. military towards the Taliban inside Afghanistan, we will continue to lose this war. We need to reassess Afghanistan. We need to, our policy in Afghanistan is a mess, frankly, and the Trump administration needs to decide what to do and how to do it quickly. Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes Dr. Jones for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thanks for holding this hearing. It is a reminder that Afghanistan is and should be still important. And over a decade and a half after the 9/11 attacks, many Americans may not realize how deeply engaged the U.S. remains in Afghanistan. Most of the media coverage up until very recently has been on counterterrorism operations in Syria, Iraq, North Korea, and a range of other locations, but Afghanistan is a frontline state. Many may also forget that the number of U.S. military forces there, which is in the neighborhood of 8,400, is larger than any other active combat zone deployment, larger than what the U.S. has in Syria, Iraq, or other combat zones. As Bill mentioned earlier, some Americans finally began to realize and remember that we still have forces there after the U.S. dropped its most powerful, or one of its most powerful, non-nuclear bombs. My comments are going to focus on 3 questions. First, what are U.S. national security interests in Afghanistan today? That's 1. 2, what's the terrorist and insurgent landscape? And then 3, at least briefly, what steps can the U.S. do to help mitigate the threat from Afghanistan and more broadly in the region? So let me turn to U.S. interests. I think there's no question the U.S. has a range of interests overseas. I mentioned earlier Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. But I do think the U.S. has several interests that remain in Afghanistan. One is there are a number of extremist groups, Islamic extremist groups, that continue to operate on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistan border. Bill mentioned them earlier. They range from Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Haqqani Network, to the Islamic State, but also a range of other ones that have operations in Central Asia. Second, I think an expanding war, if the U.S. were to leave, would also increase regional instability, particularly with countries like India, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, even China. And a particular concern to me would be what it does to the Pakistan-India competition. Those are both nuclear-armed states and have gone to war and are essentially fighting a proxy war in Afghanistan right now. Let me then move to the landscape, because I think this is important to remember. It's part of U.S. interests. The Taliban does continue to operate. It is the largest group that operates in Afghanistan. It does have its sanctuary, its command and control nodes in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. Its 3 major regional shuras are also on the Pakistan side of the border. And I would just emphasize again the chairman's remarks about the increase in Russian contacts and at least limited support to the Taliban. It is not a positive step in developments in the region. But I would point out with the Taliban does not control yet. I mean, I would certainly argue that it's increased its rural presence. It does not control yet a major urban area, which makes it a little different from what we've seen in 2014, 2015 in Iraq and cities like Mosul or other cities within Anbar. AQIS, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, my estimate is probably larger and more expansive than it was 5 to 10 years ago. It's got a presence that is larger than just what some Americans have talked about up in the Northeast, but down in the South, in Kandahar, as Bill mentioned, but also in Helmand along the Baramchah area, in Zabul, in Ghazni, in Paktika. Those are likely small cell structures. In addition, the Islamic State Khorasan province does have a presence. It looks to me like it's probably come down a little bit from a year or 2 ago, down to between 1,000 and 2,000 fighters. But I would say that it has conducted a number of attacks both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as in Bangladesh. So in my view, it's been pretty active in conducting attacks. There are other groups, the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat al-Ahrar, that have also a presence in the region. And I think in that sense, there are a milieu of groups. Just briefly, I'd note there are a range of things. I would support the ranking member's comments about focusing on governance and development. I would add electoral reform. I would also add, I think there are opportunities at the moment for reconciliation. I certainly would support at least opening up discussions. I think they're probably unlikely in the near term, but I think they're worth talking about. The range of things, and we can certainly get into this, that I would suggest pushing U.S. trainers down to the tactical level. I would support probably slightly increasing the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, but more on the train, advise, assist efforts. And I'm happy to talk more later about the steps towards Pakistan. But let me just briefly conclude by noting that the Afghan government and generally its people want the U.S. to stay. So I think we should take that seriously. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Dr. Philbeb Brown, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the subcommittee. It is an honor for me to address you today. I want to give away my punchline right at the beginning. Improving governance, not merely beefing up military efforts or attempting to counter external sponsors of terrorism in Afghanistan, is critical for the success of U.S. counterterrorism efforts. It is also critical for the broader interest the United States has in Afghanistan and the region. Yes, denying safe havens to anti-American, global, and regional terrorist groups is crucial, and it is the #1 primary objective. But U.S. interests in Afghanistan go beyond that. As Steph also mentioned, an unstable Afghanistan risks destabilizing Pakistan. The relationship is not merely the reverse, that a problematic Pakistan destabilizes Afghanistan, but also that an unstable Afghanistan destabilizes Pakistan, and as a result, Pakistan, India relationship, and the entire region of Central and South Asia. Moreover, a disintegration of the Afghan state or an outbreak of an outright civil war would be a great boost to Salafi groups around the world. Once again, a great power will have been seen as being defeated in Afghanistan. Thus, from a strategic perception perspectives, few places from a counterterrorism point of view matter as much as Afghanistan does. Moreover, U.S. reputation and self-regard are also at stake. As a country that can be relied upon to honor its commitments, including commitments to the Afghan people. The Taliban remains by far the most potent terrorist group in Afghanistan. It has not targeted U.S. assets or people outside of Afghanistan, but certainly makes it a big point to target them in Afghanistan and defines as its primary objective to drive U.S. forces out of the country. It is a major threat to the Afghan state, the Afghan government, and frankly, the very political dispensation that has been in the country since 9/11. Afghanistan remains in a highly precarious position, a highly precarious condition. As the chairman said, the Taliban today is at the strongest point at any point since 9/11. That does not mean that the Taliban does not have problems, does not have shortcomings, and suffer from deficiency and constraints. It does, but nonetheless, its military energy is showing no signs of fizzling out yet. More significantly, the Taliban is often seen as a less pernicious form of governance than even some of the power brokers associated with the Afghan government and the post-9/11 dispensation in Afghanistan. And this is indeed the fundamental problem in the country and the reason why the Taliban still today has so much capacity to regenerate and wither the military pressure from the United States, allies, and even the Afghan security forces. Unless their major progress is made in improving governance in Afghanistan and the acceptability and perceptions of governance in Afghanistan, even with beefed up US forces, we can be exactly in the same predicament 5 or 10 years from now. The government of national unity has made some important efforts to improve governance. It has taken on some corruption and criminality, but these efforts are hardly sufficient. Much more needs to take place. And the United States must make it a crucial point of its engagement with Afghanistan to insist, facilitate, and help with improving governance. The priority in improving anti-corruption and anti-crime measures clearly are in the Afghan security and defense forces. Indeed, one of the reasons they have been struggling so much on the battlefield and are taking such large casualties is because of the ethnic and patronage rifts, the corruption that plagues the services, that results in poor leadership, poor morale, and a whole host of other enable problems. Clearly, the system of corruption, the system of criminality are an enormous challenge in Afghanistan, defining the very political arrangements of the country. It is not realistic to expect that everything can be tackled, but even just taking on some steps, particularly before the next presidential election in Afghanistan, would be very important. Once again, starting with the most deleterious forms of corruption and criminality, such as rooting out discrimination against entire ethnic groups. One of the reasons why we saw the fall of Kunduz, the most significant tactical and, in fact, strategic victory of the Taliban so far, is number one. Along with that, and very much correlated with that, is focusing on the corruption and criminality in the Afghan national security forces. There are other measures beyond that that I am glad to answer or speak about during your questions.
I thank all three of the witnesses. The chair will reserve its time until the close of all the questions by the other members. So therefore, I'll recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of things, based on your testimony, I'd like to just give you the opportunity to comment on more. Could you give us some of the examples, Doctor, on the criminality and the corruption activities more specifically within the national security forces? I think your microphone is it?
Thank you. The most fundamental problem, I would say, is that positions of leadership at all levels, from unit down to higher up levels, were for years allotted on the basis of ethnic patronage, very much with mind of rivalries among specific commanders and also related to tribal and ethnic rivalries, but also have been sold out to those who can pay most for the positions. And similarly, issues such as getting leave to go to family has often been associated with those who can pay at the level of individual soldiers. Related to that, with perhaps most significant progress achieved so far, is simply on getting pay down to soldiers as well as getting equipment and
right now,
soldiers.
When I was there, they were a few years ago. They were implementing electronic payments directly, and that was a way to try and ameliorate that. Has that been utilized first, and has it been successful?
Yes, the process is underway, and it's more linked to biometric systems. One of the primary sources of focus for the U.S. military and allied military, as well as President Ghani. So progress has been achieved. It's hardly complete. The process is not full. I want to very much compliment the U.S. military in Afghanistan for insisting that only soldiers that are part of the biometric system are paid, because an immense problem has been ghost soldiers that have been receiving payment.
Thank you, Doctor. You give me some more specifics that I appreciate. Dr. Jones, you wanted some more time to talk about Pakistan and the regional instability, but also you mentioned Bangladesh. If you could really comment on Pakistan and Bangladesh and what the effects regionally are there from your vantage point.
Sure. My comments on Bangladesh were actually twofold. If I had a little more time, one is that we've seen an increase in Islamic State Khorasan province activity, including strikes in and around Bangladesh. We've also seen a growth of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent in Bangladesh as well. So we often focus a lot on Afghanistan. The terrorism problem is a regional one, and we often focus also on Pakistan, but Bangladesh has seen a major increase in jihadist activity over the past several years. So, part of the answer here is a much better regional counterterrorism and governance issue than just focusing on Afghanistan or Afghanistan.
Would you say in Bangladesh, too, with some of the things I've witnessed there in terms of the way their government is running right now, do you think that has been an incubator for this kind of activity, or do you think it's just because of geography?
Well, I think it's a combination both of geography, also strategy. When Ayman al-Zawahiri announced the creation of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, he specifically asked for Bangladesh to be included in that, so it was a strategic decision. There's also, and you can see the World Bank or Transparency International data, it's a weak state. It has allowed groups like the ones I mentioned to establish sanctuary there. So again, very serious concerns, I think, in Bangladesh.
And do any of the witnesses want to talk about what we could do with the Iranian and Russian influence in that area? Any suggestions you might have?
I think it is very important and significant and laudatory that General Nicholson highlighted the pernicious role of Russia. It's not new. It's been in the making for a number of years. Even during Russia's nominal cooperation with the United States in Afghanistan, it has been halting and sporadic, and it's clearly disintegrated as part of the difficult U.S.-Russia relationship. There are no easy fixes, but exposure is an important first step. And there are other ways to engage diplomatically with Russia, hence, Ranking Member, to emphasize your crucial statements in the beginning about the role of the State Department and the fact that wars cannot simply be won on the military battlefield. The diplomatic effort, as well as the development
Briefly on the issue of the Russians supplying arms to the Taliban, is some of that just part of their the way they act criminally? For their own revenues, criminal syndicates and things, or do you think it's strategic or both?
I do believe it's strategic. There is no doubt that the Russian military has dealt with issues of criminal involvement and criminal perpetration, including in the narcotics trade. But I do believe that in the case of supplying weapons to the Taliban, it is a very controlled strategic decision, unlike in the case of rogue members of the Afghan military selling weapons and equipment to the Taliban as well. I do want to emphasize, however, that support for the Taliban, such as from Iran, in my view, no more than the support that Russia provides, is also very much a function of the regional disbelief at this point that a stable, successful government in Afghanistan, as envisioned after 9/11, can be achieved. And it is the tremendous insecurity and uncertainty about what will happen with the government, including as a result of the lack of clarity of U.S. position, that encourages
so we get back to
hedging
governance,
behavior.
too. I know my time is over, so I want to yield that back, but we go back to governance again. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Colonel Cook, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Continuing the conversation, I wanted to ask how the Chinese view the disturbing role of Russia there, particularly being an ally of, well, China being an ally of Pakistan. And of course, they border Afghanistan. And is that viewed as a major threat anytime the Russians do something along a border that's close to China? And that's up to anyone to address that if they could.
Sure, I'll address that. I can't speak to what China has or hasn't done with respect to Russian arming of the Taliban, but the Chinese certainly have an interest in stability in Afghanistan. They have economic interest and obviously security interest there as well. And there is a group that is based, it's called the Turkestan Islamic Party. It's made up of primarily ethnic Uyghurs from Western China. And they conduct attacks. They primarily are based in Afghanistan and are closely allied with Al-Qaeda as well as the Taliban. They fight inside Afghanistan alongside those groups. And so you have that bleed back problem where fighters that come from China to fight inside of Afghanistan come back. And that's a major security issue, security concern for the Chinese government.
If I can just add, I mean, I would say, broadly speaking, the Chinese have several interests. One is, historically, it is the economic interest, what I would call soft power. They do have access to a range of mines, although they have been slow to develop them because of the security situation. Two, they have been involved in peace negotiations, so trying to bring the Taliban to the peace table, have not been particularly successful about that. And three, they have had terrorism concerns. I suspect that anything that would exacerbate their concerns about terrorist activity in the region, including Russian support, would make China somewhat nervous.
Doctor?
I agree with those comments. Perhaps only to add, there is rivalry between China and Russia. It's taking place in Central Asia. That rivalry is perhaps not without restraint, but nonetheless that's clearly taking place. So this is yet another element of the rivalry and the threats and interests of China that Seth and Bill articulated. Also then imply that China cannot be happy with Russia's maneuvers toward the Taliban.
I want to address the poppy and the drugs that finance the Taliban. And it almost seems counterproductive for the Russians to be supporting the Taliban if you're worried about some of these drugs that would go up through Uzbekistan into Russia, which has had some concerns about growing drug problems of its own. Could you address that drug situation? Because it's, as I said, it doesn't seem logical.
Sure, I'll be very glad to do that. A lot of my expertise is on the issues of drugs, including in Afghanistan. So you are right, Representative Cook, about poppy being often emphasized as a key interest and problem of Russia. Russia has long blamed the United States for poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, accusing the U.S. of being at best incompetent and often purposeful in allowing poppy cultivation as a tool of poisoning the Russian nation. Obviously, those are outrageous and incorrect claims. The larger issue, of course, is that it is enormously difficult to suppress poppy cultivation, as the Russian government is well aware. And in fact, any aggressive eradication measures will only feed the Taliban insurgency. The Taliban derives a great deal of support by being able to protect itself offer itself as a protector of the poppy farmers. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Islamic State in Nangarhar is so particularly challenged is because it has prohibited poppy cultivation there and essentially mobilized populations in Achin, Shinwar, Khogyani against itself. However, Russia's interest in countering the drug trade is offset by its other interests, and I would say that Russia's driving interest these days is to be as challenging to the United States across the world as possible.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We are in the process of votes. We do have time for one more series of questions from Ms. Frankel from Florida. That is right.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panel for being here. So, I guess probably myself, like most Americans, are just very frustrated. My own son served in the military in Afghanistan as well as USAID, so I've heard a lot of war stories. I want to ask you this. Compared to pre-9/11, which obviously led to the catastrophe of the towers, how would you compare Afghanistan and the dangers currently?
Sure, I'll tackle that. Well, prior to 9/11, Al-Qaeda was operating training camps with no threat, really little threat, other than maybe an occasional cruise missile strike or something like that. And they were doing it with the support of the Taliban. So you had, you had the state sponsorship side. As such, the Taliban was a state, and they were operating unfettered. Today, Afghanistan is a war zone, and we have American forces there, and they're engaging and targeting and killing Al-Qaeda leaders and trying to prevent them from maintaining safe haven. However, that camp that I mentioned in Shorbak in Kandahar province, that was operating for some time before Americans only found out about it when they conducted a raid in Paktika province several months prior and killed a senior Al-Qaeda leader there. And then they discovered evidence of that camp, and that's when then they spent several months planning the attack. So, and also I would add that this continuous fighting really serves as a recruiting machine for jihadist groups. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be fighting them there, but the longer we're there fighting, the more they're going out and selling their wares. They're getting jihadists to join their cause, be it the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or the myriad of Pakistani jihadist groups operating there. Thank you.
If I can add to that, I mean, I think pre-9/11, with Al-Qaeda's sanctuary and external plotting, and with assistance from the Taliban regime, the threat level to the U.S. was obviously extremely high. Over the next couple of years, it varied somewhat. I mean, I would point to the period of 2009 and 2010, where we had several active plots that went back to that area, Faisal Shahzad in New York City, as well as Najibul Azazi, also New York City plots. I think today, the threat level is serious. I don't see the same number today of external plotting by AQIS, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, or core Al-Qaeda. But I would say that as we look at future trends, particularly with the return of foreign fighters from Iraq and Syria to the region, it is a serious danger of becoming something like that in the future.
So I guess that leads to my next question, which is, does that call for keeping the troops there, more troops? Obviously, I guess you've talked about, Doctor, about USAID type efforts and with the governance and the corruption. I would be curious as to whether you've seen any progress at all in terms of the governance and the corruption issue. But if you could answer both those questions.
I definitely see progress. Clearly, President Ghani is motivated to take on corruption and criminality. He has been constrained, and much more than has been done needs to be done. Unfortunately, more broadly, the Afghan political elite continues to be constantly preoccupied and distracted with brinksmanship and politicking and not sufficiently focused on governance. And here is a crucial element of where U.S. policy needs to engage. If the United States decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, we would be in a situation of full-blown civil war with the Taliban controlling significant territories. No doubt the situation would be dire in the country with serious repercussions for the United States. I do believe that there is good reason to have more troops in Afghanistan, simply because the current force posture does not allow really for any meaningful U.S. presence outside of Kabul, or even in terms of assistance and eyes on the ground, such as in economic efforts. However, I also believe that the continuing U.S. engagement, military engagement, needs to be coupled with a very explicit political strategy. And I don't mean by the negotiations with the Taliban simply or predominantly, but rather very explicit engagement with the Afghan government about improving governance. So yes, there is some progress, but hardly sufficient, and that needs to be the core of U.S. engagement in the country.
Thank you. I think my time, Mr. Chairman, I just want to, Mr. Roger, I just want to understand something that you said. You said that fighting begets fighting, and yet I think you're all advocating that we maintain our troops. So is the theory to try to maintain the troops without fighting, or let just as advisors and trainers?
Yeah, Afghanistan certainly is a catch-22 situation at this time, given the length of time we've been there, and I think we've lost the trust of a lot of Afghans. However, I don't see any other option. I agree with Dr. Brown. If we pull our forces out there, if we disengage from Afghanistan, it will be largely run by the Taliban, large Taliban pockets in the south, east, north. You'll have Al-Qaeda back in strength. So we have to continue fighting them, and we have to work hard at the governance side as well. We really need to find the right, it's amazing to me that almost 16 years, we haven't found the right incentives to get the Afghans to do what they need to do to take this fight to the Taliban to defeat them. I also agree, negotiations, we have been down this path numerous times. We've been fooled by the Taliban. The Taliban are motivated. Yes, they have their problems militarily, politically, but there is no incentive for them at this point in time. They believe they're winning. They are winning in some areas, and we're not going to get them off the battlefield by negotiating with them. They need to be defeated militarily. We never have done that, and that's going to be extremely difficult until we solve the Pakistan angle, which we've all discussed multiple times here. Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman from Florida. The subcommittee will be in recess until 10 minutes after the final vote. There are 3 votes. Mr. Rohrbacher from California will be the next questioner of the panel. Subcommittee will come to order. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Surfin Rohrabacher.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll have to amend your introduction. It's not the surfing Rohrabacher, it's the suffering Rohrabacher now. Well, listen, I've enjoyed your testimony today. I'm going to have some challenges about some of the positions that you have been advocating. That doesn't mean I don't respect you. I do, because you seem like you're smart and you've done your homework, but I do disagree with you on some things. Also, perhaps there'd be some alternatives that you need to think about that maybe you haven't, and maybe we haven't as a country. But first, let me ask some specific questions on issues. How much heroin and opium is now being produced in Afghanistan?
I do not remember the exact number from last year, but it's a very high number. It's believed to supply at least 90% of the world's opiate production.
You know, about billions of dollars?
Yes, and a significant portion of the country's GDP. So the United Nations Drugs and Crime Office estimates, or used to put out the number, they stopped putting out the number, that only about 4% of Afghanistan's GDP is linked to opium poppy. That's a very significant underestimate. They only measure the farm gate production.
Okay,
I think it's
we are talking about billions of dollars that we know is floating around Afghanistan. And is it fair to say that a significant amount of that money gets into the hands of Islamic terrorists, including the Taliban? Okay, no, nobody disagrees with that?
Certainly the Taliban, there's been no evidence that the money has been going to other terrorist groups. It's a significant number of that money gets to the hands of power brokers linked with the Afghan government.
But the Taliban, which does have relationships with other groups, the Taliban does get a fair amount of money from.
Okay, so the Taliban gets a fair amount of money, and of course, the Afghan government, who we put into place, corrupt officials in that group, including the family of Mr. Karzai, maybe, we're talking about billions of dollars of wealth. Well, with billions of dollars going like that, coming out like that, I can imagine that would buy a lot of AK-47 bullets, and people wonder where people get the money now. Do you think we would have the ability, I don't know, are any of you aware that we now have the ability to drop to spray an area, and that within a short period of time, in a way that will not hurt other crops, that would eliminate the poppy production in Afghanistan and basically would not permit it to grow in that area again for 10 years? Are you aware of that government program? Okay, let me note for the record, Mr. Chairman, that we have had that capability for at least 20 years and have not touched it and not done it. When we didn't do it after 9/11, we had that capability and we didn't do it. After 9/11, there were storehouses of opium where the Taliban had stored billions of dollars of opium and heroin in special locations in Afghanistan. And I would just go on the record for the first time on this. I notified our government at the very highest level exactly where those were, and they needed to be bombed because they needed to be, the Taliban needed to be denied that money, and our government never did that. Our government never did it. The excuse was always, well, we think that might be too close to a mosque. All right. Let me get some. In terms of our alternatives now, okay, we ended up bringing Karzai in. We already heard an assessment of how the level of corruption associated with the Karzai regime and the Karzai family. We created that. Those of us who were engaged with this effort before that time wanted the king to return the king. He was the one guy, Pushtun and the rest of them, who everybody respected. And instead, we brought in Karzai, who it appears from what is being said today, oversaw massive corruption. And, but now back to how we now are so now we're in a bad spot. We didn't do what was right then, and now we are in a bad spot. And let me just say it for the record, Mr. Chairman, that the alternative is not just putting more U.S. troops into Afghanistan. And let me ask the question of our panel, do you know how many U.S. troops were in Afghanistan after 9/11 at the time when the Taliban were driven out of Kabul? Do we know? 200. 200. So obviously 200 Americans weren't the ones who drove them out, was the Northern Alliance. And instead of having a government in which we respected these individual leaders and a decentralized approach, have any of you read the Afghan Constitution? Have you read the Afghan? Okay. Who in the Afghan Constitution, who appoints the local police? Kabul. Who appoints the local educators? Kabul. We gave them, Mr. Chairman, the most centralized government plan for the people who are the most decentralized culture in the world, and now they're upset, and they're willing to go along with any number of groups. And I'm going to leave it as one thought, because I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, Mr. Chairman. The Flying Tigers came in, and really, they were private people, and they were saving Chiang Kai-shek from this onslaught of the Japanese before Pearl Harbor. They were actually on the way. Their first mission actually happened a couple days after Pearl Harbor, but they were on their way over to create an air force. We need air cover, do we not, sir? Do or not our friends in Afghanistan need air cover? There is now being proposed by a private sector, folks that were not dissimilar from the Flying Tigers, that they would go to Afghanistan and provide this service. And I would hope that anybody reading this testimony understands that if we don't need to send massive troops in when private sector people will get the job done, or people in their own country would get it done. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for taking time to be here today. Based on recent statements by General Nicholson and Secretary Mattis, it appears increasingly clear that Russia has been arming the Taliban. What is your assessment of Russian intentions in Afghanistan? And I'd like to hear an opinion from maybe the three of you. How do you think the United States should respond to Russia's intervention in Afghanistan?
Sure. I believe Russia's intentions are primarily focused on targeting the growing threat of the Islamic State. What used to be Al-Qaeda's branch in the Caucasus has now become part of the Islamic State, and there's a threat also that emanates from the region, from the Islamic State. They're concerned about that in the Central Asian countries, which are in Russian sphere of influence, as well as attacks in their country. So I think part of that is an attempt, because the Taliban and the Islamic State are enemies. They do fight each other, although this was more common a year or two ago. They've sort of kind of come to some uneasy truce. I believe that I think this is also a ploy by the Russians to gain influence with the Taliban, as well as, as possibly a little payback for United States efforts in Afghanistan in the 1980s. As far as what the United States can do about this, I think there's only really political pressure can be applied. As far as Russian support for the Taliban, it's pretty low on the chain. When you look at it, you got the primary state sponsor for the Taliban and jihadist groups in Pakistan or in Afghanistan is Pakistan. And I would even say Iran poses a bigger threat with its support for the Taliban as well. Russia, they're providing light arms. As far as I could tell at this point in time, we haven't had a lot of specifics of what that Russian support is. But really, the only solution is diplomatic here. We're not going to go to war for the Russians, with the Russians for providing a small amount of arms to the Taliban.
Thank you.
I would say, based on my look at this, there are at least 3 potential motivations for Russia right now. One, I think if we look broadly at Russian operations in Syria, even Russian presence in Libya, as well as in Afghanistan and other locations, they are expanding and are attempting to expand their influence as part of a resurgence effort. Second, I think they are concerned about the Islamic State and other groups operating in Afghanistan, particularly ones that may come back from Iraq and Syria into Central Asia, the Caucasus, and South Asia. And third, they have had some concerns about U.S. withdrawal from the region and what gets left on their southern flank. I mean, I think there are a few things that the U.S. can do. One is, to continue to target, as the U.S. has, the Islamic State in the region, including in Afghanistan. It is a threat. So I think there is some reason for the Russians to be concerned about ISIS there. I think the U.S. should stop saying, as it's done at various points over the last couple of years, that it's going to leave. I think that may be helpful, so the Russians realize we're not leaving for the foreseeable future. It's a conditions-based effort. And I think, and Vanda said this earlier, that we should be as transparent as possible on what they're doing.
Thank you.
So we have evidence to show it publicly.
Thank you. Dr. Brown.
I agree with the 3 stated motivation. Russia's official justification for its engagement and not denial of support for the Taliban has been that the Islamic State is a bigger threat for them. I think that is their calculation. I don't think that's their sole calculation, however. I do believe that Russia, like other regional actors, are uncertain about the outcome and are hedging and cultivating proxies. It is not simply the Taliban that Russia is engaging, but also other proxies that have been, not violently, but in political opposition opposed to Kabul. So it's a wide range of actors that Russia is engaging, just as Iran is engaging, and clearly they have now moved to directly military cultivating the Taliban. And I do believe that Russia defines its primary strategic objective as challenging the United States across the world. They waited in Afghanistan to challenge the United States, but they never wholeheartedly supported U.S. efforts in Afghanistan. And now they determined that this is yet another theater where they can engage. I do believe that the primary response is one of diplomatic exposure and diplomatic engagement and perhaps diplomatic isolation of Russia. However, there are other interdiction options, also not of Russian agents in the Taliban, but certainly of some of the proxies that Russia is engaging with. That does not necessarily mean military eliminating them, but perhaps blowing up the heroin stockpiles that the representative mentioned that belong to proxies and favorite power brokers of Russia's in Afghanistan is a tool, is a signal.
Thank you, and my time is up. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Chairman Poe. Thank you to you and the ranking member for calling this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for sharing with us your perspectives. This is obviously, as you've stated, a very complex issue. Before I continue, I also want to join with my colleagues in extending my personal and our condolences to the families of the fallen fighters in Afghanistan. Our thoughts and prayers are with them. Mr. Ruggiero, and I mentioned this to you on the break, you edit something called the Long War, and that could be looking backward. We have been in Afghanistan now approaching its 16th year, or it could be looking forward. From your perspective, what are we looking at going forward as far as the time of our involvement here?
Yes, this long war has expanded greatly since 9/11. If we look at it, we look at just the threat of Al-Qaeda. It was operating in Afghanistan alongside the Taliban, fighting the Northern Alliance, running training camps. And then it had a small presence in a couple of countries throughout the world, operated on the cellular level. Since, particularly with the Arab Spring, the jihadist threat has expanded greatly. We now have active war zones in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Mali, Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. We can go on listing the countries where we have active jihadist insurgencies. We've had attacks here in the homeland, attacks in Europe. The reality is we are fighting this enemy militarily, but we're not tackling their ideology, which to me is the prime driver of these Islamist militant groups. Until we come up, we and our allies come up with a way to discredit them, to discredit their ideology, we're just not killing them fast enough. We have great success in killing terrorist leaders, in killing fighters and drone strikes, and that's been fine, but they've shown a remarkable capability to replace their leadership. And that's the way they've been expanding their operations.
And I'm sorry, just because of time, and they are resilient. But if I can turn to Dr. Jones, and I think it was you that said this. If not, I apologize. I may have lost it while we had stepped away. But you indicated that our policy across administrations has been, I think the term you used was a mess. And
Bill may have used that.
all right. So that's what I may have gotten it right. But my question, this is for the whole panel, is as we look at the policy as it is today, we look at the challenges, and Mr. Roger, you talked about how resilient they are and how quickly they have expanded and can pop up with new members, new resources. As we try to put a policy into place that has a sense of order, what does that order look like? What specific goals would you apply? What would be the timelines we should be considering as we look at policy here from our position?
Sure, I've got a couple of comments on that. I mean, I think as I've looked at this, and I've been involved myself in this as a civilian in the military in Afghanistan, I think our objectives at this point should be fairly limited. We're dealing with a government that has challenges, is relatively weak, but I would set up several objectives. One is to prevent the Taliban from overthrowing the government and from holding urban terrain, major urban terrain. And I think that's potentially doable. I think we should continue to target groups that are plotting attacks against the U.S., both here and overseas. And I think we should continue to support the government and local actors as well on the ground. I don't know the timelines there. I think those are in American interests. I think one can do those with a limited presence on the ground, both diplomatic, development, and military. But I think that's a condition-based approach rather than a timeline. And I think as long as we're moving in those directions and the government is relatively competent, I would personally support that.
Dr. Feldman-Brown, your perspective, you bring experience beyond just this region across the globe. What do you see as some of the objectives, challenges, and metrics that we can measure progress by?
We are in the unfortunate position of not having a good alternative to persevering. We can decide to liquidate the mission in Afghanistan, and indeed, to quote prominent U.S. strategists, or paraphrase, the hallmark of a wise power is to know when to liquidate unwise commitments. I don't believe we have reached that stage in Afghanistan. Our perseverance still keeps the country from outright civil war and the Taliban from toppling the regime and holding significant territories. Those are very important means to achieving or to maintaining U.S. objectives. I would think about the conditions under which the U.S. support would no longer be maintaining those objectives, such as if the Afghan military turned on itself, if there were massive defections, if, in fact, political infighting started in advance of the presidential 2019 elections. Those would be markers for me to reconsider liquidating, despite the terrible cost to U.S. counterterrorism objectives. Until then, I do believe that we need to persevere, perhaps with a boosted military presence as well. However, that perseverance and that military presence cannot be decoupled from strong focus on governance. We need to change the perceptions of the Afghan people, where the Taliban is really not so much worse than the predatory rule of local power brokers or even Afghan officials associated with the government.
Thank you. My time is up. As with all complex issues, but especially here, the answers to a question leads to so many more questions. I wish we had more time, but thank you for being here.
And the gentleman can submit those questions for the record, and we'll make sure that the witnesses invite those, answer those questions in a timely manner, not take 16 years to answer them for us. I'll recognize myself, as I mentioned, as last to ask questions. I want to read a statement made by the ambassador from Afghanistan to the United Nations, only portions of it. In recent months, dozens of terrorist attacks across Afghanistan have claimed scores of innocent lives. The Taliban have claimed responsibility for most of these attacks, but regardless of whose names are being labeled on these attacks, our own investigations have clearly established that they were generally plotted beyond our frontiers on the other side of the Durand Line, mainly Pakistan. Mr. President, it is a fundamental factor which needs to be addressed. So I want to address that with the remaining time that we have. Dr. Jones, I'll ask you first. Explain, as you can concisely, what Pakistan's mischief is regarding terrorist groups that are related to Pakistan, hide in Pakistan, and they go to Afghanistan. Explain that relationship if you can.
Sure. I think this in part comes down to what I would call great power politics, meaning Afghanistan sits, and Pakistan has a major border with Afghanistan. Afghanistan's strongest regional ally is India. That is unacceptable to Pakistan. India is an enemy. So while the Afghan government has an ally in the Indian government, Pakistan has resorted to proxy organizations to further its foreign policy goals, both in places like Jammu and Kashmir against the Indians and in Afghanistan, and that means support to organizations like the Haqqani Network and the Taliban. So it's a proxy war.
Either one of our other witnesses want to weigh in on this?
I would agree with Dr. Jones. Yeah, this is the Pakistani government is, continuing with its policy or strategy of strategic depth. It views everything through the lens of fighting India. And that, unfortunately, some of these jihadist groups that have spawned from the Pakistani efforts to fight India, to establish strategic depth in Afghanistan, it's come back to bite them with groups like the Movement of Taliban in Pakistan and other groups which have attacked the Pakistani state. And unfortunately, Pakistan seems unwilling to recognize this. It's still, while it fights the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, it continues to support other groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and a host of other groups because they're willing to serve as Pakistan's strategic depth until the Pakistani government and leaders and military intelligence, until they come to grips with this, this problem is going to exist for decades.
Would you agree that with the statement of Admiral Mullen, excuse me, in 2011, that the Haqqani Network acts as a veritable arm of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency?
Yeah, absolutely would agree. And keep in mind, the operational leader of the Haqqani Network, Siraj Haqqani, he is also one of 2 deputy emirs for the Taliban. The Haqqani Network is, they'll tell you, their propaganda has said, look, we don't exist, there is no Haqqani Network. We are the Taliban. That's both true and untrue. It's a subset of the Taliban. Its leaders are integrated with the Taliban, so it's a major, it's receiving major support from the Pakistani government, and they're killing Americans, and we really need to figure out a way to get Pakistan to stop supporting the Taliban.
And in recent years, the United States has given over $33 billion in some form of aid to Pakistan. Pakistan directly or indirectly supports the Haqqani Network, in theory. That network, as we mentioned earlier, has killed more Americans in the region than any other terrorist group. To me, that is something that we should not accept.
Yes, sir.
That we should not accept sending money to a country that supports a terrorist group that kills Americans. I think there's a real problem with that. Dr. Jones, you want to weigh in on that?
No, I think it's a serious problem. I mean, I've been on the receiving end of it myself. I've lost friends and colleagues because of Haqqani Network attacks. I think it's a very, very serious problem. I would support, as the U.S. did last year, when it has a strike against a Taliban leader, as it did with Mullah Mansour, to take that strike. I mean, I think it's worth considering the costs and benefits, but I would applaud the administration for targeting the Taliban leader last year.
All right, I will yield back the remainder of my time. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. Certainly want to thank the members of the committee. This has not been an encouraging hearing, the 16-year war that is taking place, but I appreciate you being here. Maybe we can figure out some solutions for what Congress's role should be and advise the administration as well. This subcommittee is adjourned.